Average guy, old stories hit high, tells of struggle and strife. Keep your head in the fight. Broken bones in the street, ain't no place for the weak. From the land of the brave, where the words cut deep. Coming next on the air, now feel the despair. Generation X, shout out, shattered somewhere. Rising up from the dark with a fire and spark. Rage and passion combined to leave a lasting mark. Coming next, shouting loud, voices from the crowd. Through the mist of...
All right, welcome to Common X Podcast with Jared and Ian. We are your co-hosts, Ian Primer and Jared Mazak. Today's guest, in a world of clickbait Beatles facts and TikTok music historians, this guy's the real deal. Author of over 30 books and still making headlines with stories the mainstream missed. Dr. Kenneth Womack. Welcome to Common X, where the revolution is still being broadcast. How are you today?
Doing great. Great to be with you both.
It's good to have you on today.
Yeah. So, Dr. Womack, you've written over 30 books and tackled every corner of Beatles lore. Was there a moment early on when you thought, yeah, I'm really onto something here?
I think it goes back to junior high school, right? We all remember that. A big moment in a Gen X rite of passage. And I had just discovered the Beatles. And I remember writing about them for my my junior high newspaper, which I hope is still in print, the Kingwood Cougar in Texas.
Wow.
And and I wrote about the Paul is Dead mystery. And I kind of thought at the time, I didn't think there was much else to say about them. I think I was wrong, but
30 books later, yeah, maybe.
maybe so. Yeah.
Right.
So, and you're a professor, right? Do your students realize they're learning Beatles history from literally the guy who wrote the encyclopedia?
You know, what's great about today's students is that they're so curious. It's a fantastic generation. I've now taught since the 1990s, incredibly, and I really think they're the best group yet I've met. They're just interested in the right things. I'm not sure about us as Gen X if we were ever interested in the right things, but I think they are, and I like that a lot about them. Just their curiosity. They like to know things. They want to know how to fix things. They want experience, right? When I think about them, you know, they recognize that the Beatles are important. But when I teach a course, as I do every fall on the Beatles, it typically takes the form of a kind of art appreciation course. It just says the Beatles on it. But what I'm really teaching them is how to think about artwork. And in this case, the artwork is a thing called the Beatles. And they're 12 or so studio albums from 1963 to 1969. But really, it's just about appreciating art so that hopefully, in the grand scheme of things, when they're watching the latest episode of True Detective or whatever they consume, right, that they have a vocabulary for how to think about it and how to interpret why True Detective matters to them, or Pokemon, or, fill in the blank. It could be anything. And it's the same for all of us.
Yeah, that's an interesting viewpoint. So with teaching the students of today, do you see them being very creative? Or has social media kind of driven out creativity?
Well, I just have, there's a new wrinkle in my course over the last couple of years. I've taught it for a long time. I teach it now at Monmouth University. I taught it before at Penn State. And the new wrinkle is actually a creative one, and it is defined by social media. So there's always been a lot of writing that I have my students do. I'm professor of English and popular music. So I'm kind of marrying those two areas together, English and music. And a colleague of mine, a historian, Hetty Williams, here on the shore, suggested to me that I have enough writing already. Why don't I do something else for another project? And I've started a new unit called The Unessay. And it literally is a non-essay. Their job is to take, in this case, the Beatles or Springsteen, which I teach in the spring, but to take the Beatles and explore some aspect about them using the tools of social media. So they might make a lyric video, or sometimes they'll record a song themselves, or maybe they'll make a presentation in PowerPoint or Keynote. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
it asks them to do something with all sorts of different kinds of imagery, as opposed to just writing another essay about the Beatles. I don't know that we necessarily need that right now. What
Right.
we probably do need is more art.
Yeah, definitely. So do you encourage them to use tools like AI or discourage them,
Oh,
like
no,
ChatGPT or
absolutely. I
anything?
mean, I discourage them from using AI, say, on their exam, right? With
Right.
take home midterm and a take home final.
Hmm.
I don't want to hear some artificial voice on that, but
Right.
absolutely, if they want to
Okay.
create new kinds of images, hybrid images, right?
Hmm.
Ways to explain what's going on. I don't know, pick a song, Lady Madonna, right? Take a song
Hmm.
like that and bring it to life. Do whatever you need to do, right? Use the tools that you're comfortable with. So some of them will make TikTok videos. Some of them will make, like I said, lyric videos are pretty popular because you can do kind of a scavenger hunt on the web and pick images to bring the song to life.
Right.
But I like to let them approach it where they like to. So I have a lot of music majors, and sometimes, for example, a couple semesters ago, a woman sang. She's a choir student, and so she sang
Hmm.
Bella some of the songs, and it was actually damn good.
That's cool.
Yeah, and
Do
actually,
you
I
do
love
you
them
have a
because
TikTok?
I don't think I do.
Okay.
Unless somebody made it for you.
I've had some, yeah, I've gotten some attention and some videos and some reviews, but no, I don't. I don't regularly work in that genre.
Gotcha. Do you still remember the first Beatles song that hit you like lightning?
I bet it's true for you guys too. They were just always there, right? I mean, in our world, a lot of things were just always there, like Gilligan, or
Right.
I mean, you name it, right? There were
Hmm.
always these kinds of cultural touch. Peabody and Sherman. I was really surprised to note recently with those guys that they were only on for 4 or 5 years, and they stopped in 1964, and yet they were such a part of our youth and the Wayback Machine and all of that business, right? So the Beatles were always there. They were just more monolithic than most things. So I knew a lot of the songs because my parents had the radio on when they would drive me places in the early 70s and mid 70s, etc. They were just always there. But I was really hit by them in 1977 when I would have been 11. My favorite show, the Newzoo Review, was canceled. I watched it every morning with breakfast, and it was part of my probably obsessive compulsive routine. And one day it was gone. They had canceled the show. It was about a Freddie the Frog and Henrietta Hippo were the characters. And it really wasn't great, but it was what I had my Cheerios with, right?
Right.
And it was gone. And I guess the Houston Independent Network that had it had no other choice, so they threw on the Beatles cartoons, those really crummy cartoons from the '60s,
Uh-huh.
which we had all completely missed because we're Gen X.
Right.
That was one and done. It was gone, and so they had been syndicated quite suddenly again. And the cartoons are terrible. They're not good.
Yep.
But
No,
what
they're
is
not.
Yeah, they're just awful. The stories aren't good.
Yeah.
They're not even their voices, but the songs, right? I remember hearing the first thing I think I heard was "Help."
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
just, and it's an arresting song, right? I mean, it just explodes into existence. It's an amazing little tune, and um, I guess in the disco late '70s, when I was really starting to listen to the radio for the first time, the Beatles sounded different, and at a certain point, better than most of what I was experiencing. Now, when it comes to music, the '70s are my period. I love the '70s. I'm far more interested in the '70s than the '60s for most art, actually. But yeah, it was Help that just really caught my ear. I couldn't believe I hadn't been listening to that thing in heavy rotation already.
Yeah. So, and Question for you. So most people talk about how the Beatles influenced the 60s generation, right? But
Right.
how do you think Gen X absorbed and reinterpreted the Beatles message, especially like growing up in a more cynical era that we grew up in?
Yeah. Yeah, we really, that is the word for us too, is cynical.
Yeah,
When students ask me about our generation versus theirs, I said, I like the fact that you guys want to know things, you want to do things. I think we just wanted to get paid. Um,
yeah. Head,
half the
well,
time.
that's how we were kind of taught, right? Head down,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
be
and
seen,
it
not heard.
exactly. And I think that wasn't probably the best approach for us, but well, we can blame our parents. It is their fault after all.
Sure. Yep.
Um, yeah. So I think that, with the Beatles, there was a period, and we're the problem here. There was a period where the Beatles, the only period where they've ever really waned in terms of their grasp, their on culture would be the early 1980s. There was a period there, very short, but there was a period with the onset of the CD and the Beatles' reluctance to run galloping into that sphere where we
Hmm.
kind of didn't connect with them. But when you look at bands that we loved, or at least if we didn't personally, other members of our generation do and did from the 80s, a lot of them were just reinterpreting what the Beatles were doing. I mean, even pick a band that I like a lot, Depeche Mode, right? I mean, then
Hmm.
I went to a talk here, my wife and I did in the city. They were at NYU, and they were explaining how they approached music. And really, they said, we just weren't good enough to play the guitar, so we played keyboards. Right?
Nice. Yep.
And they said, why? And Dave Gahan, the lead singer, said, well, because the guitar is hard. you know,
Right.
I think that's sort of how we approached it. We also had an issue with bands like the Beatles because a lot of us, not me, but a lot of folks had older brothers and sisters who were just devoted to them, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew a lot of kids who rejected the Beatles because they were their older brother or older sister's band. And if we had problems back in the 80s as Gen X, it was we weren't sure about our coolness and how we would be cool after the 60s, because we are the first generation after the baby boom, after the folks who would blazed so many trails in the 1960s, and we did seem uncool by comparison, if only in our own minds, because I know we're cool.
Yeah. I mean, we did invent the internet, so
We did do that, and a lot of other things, right?
right.
I mean, our lives. It's amazing how the lives of a Gen Xer have changed. We grew up with, you could still have bought 8-track tapes. You could
Yep.
still have, we certainly were part of the cassette boom. And yet we're on the other side using with ease the technology of today. That's not the same for the baby boomers who struggle, right? Or others.
Correct.
We have pretty seamlessly moved through technology because we had to. My father, I remember, showed up with a computer at our house in like 1980. It was an Apple II, I think, and we suddenly had this thing, and if we wanted to learn how to play games on it, we had to learn how to interact with it, right? Just the way we've moved through technology has been pretty fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
So talking about that Gen X and kind of that attitude of like, were we cool or whatever, I gotta ask you about Mal Evans. I mean, living the Beatles legend. So Mal Evans has always felt like this mysterious, loyal figure behind the curtain. What part of his story do you think has been most misunderstood?
Well, a lot of ways, it's his whole character. And I'd be guilty of this too. Before they asked me to write about this subject a few years ago, I would have thought that Mal was kind of a lumbering oaf behind the scenes who carried amps. who was kind of lost and misbegotten. And it's just not true. He was this, like all of us, he was a pretty well-rounded and interesting character. Um, but cliched in the sense that when he gets to the other side of the Beatles phenomenon, and there's nothing like the Beatles, right? We can find two or three examples that maybe are comparable. I don't know, Star Wars, right? You
Right.
know, it's such a small cultural niche because they're the outliers. Well, what do you do if you're part of that? On the other side of it, I mean, the Beatles themselves had trouble coming out of that experience. So Mal certainly did too. But the most misunderstood part about him is his death. We were told that he was an accidental, mistaken identity, a case of mistaken identity with the LA police, and we bought that as literal truth. And it became clear to me pretty early on while working on this project, getting police reports, talking to the family, that that just wasn't the case, that it was a suicide by cop. He was just a pioneer. They didn't have the term yet.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. Now you had access to his diaries and his personal photos. What was the most human moment you came across in his writings?
Um, just the struggle to invent this field, right? I mean, that was before the Beatles. They weren't really rock stars, right? I mean, they
Right.
had to invent this whole business. They had to invent how it is that you would create what it means to be a roadie. Why, what do you need to go on tour? The Beatles start when they go out on the road and they're basically playing two-bit clubs and ballrooms. Well, on the flip side, they're playing Shea Stadium,
Right.
right?
Giant
Yeah.
stadiums. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they're
Wow.
playing these massive places. They had to invent their business. They had to, as I said to many of the 200 or 300 people I talked to for that book, they had to invent their job. There was no
Mhm.
job that existed. Same thing with recording industry, right? I mean, the way people approached the
Yeah.
recording industry and that whole business was not the same as the way it started.
Now he kind of seemed to be the Beatles' emotional anchor. Do you think he realized how vital he was?
I think he didn't live long enough, I think, to totally reflect on that, but he did realize that he played the kind of role where he would sometimes be their foil. If he knew that if they fought with him or made fun of him, then maybe they'd be nicer to each other and they could get more mileage out of whatever it is that they were working on at the time. And being the older guy, not necessarily more mature, but being the older guy,
Yeah.
he did. Um, he did. He was able to sort of see himself in that kind of light, and he recognized, and he must have, right? I mean, only a handful of people were sitting there in that studio with them. In 7 years, they go from "Love Me Do" to the Abbey Road album.
Right.
I mean,
Quite the
what the
Yeah,
journey.
it's insane.
there is no journey like that. And no one's ever made a journey. Picasso doesn't do that. James Joyce, Shakespeare, forget it. They don't do that. It just doesn't happen. It's so off the charts, over the top. And Mao was there watching, and more importantly, I guess, hearing this unfold. And my takeaway is that he is the heart of the band, but he's also the reason that they could do what they did. After about 10 or 12 hours in the studio, it's pretty easy to say, let's go home. We'll see you in a couple days. I got to go get over
Right.
this. Mal was the reason they could be workaholics. Mal was the reason that they could stay up all night and then come right back the next afternoon and continue working, putting in 1,000 hours on the White Album. He's the reason why. Maybe it hastened their end, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think the Beatles needed very badly to break up, and it was one of their best moves. I'm not in the majority when I say that. I think breaking up was brilliant. because they walk off the stage in the summer of 1969 and they never come back,
Right.
right?
At their
That
height.
yeah, it's mystique. It creates magnificent mystique. Whereas every other band, just endlessly comes back. I love the Who, but come on,
Mhm.
another farewell tour, right? You know,
Right.
let's stop it. But Mal was the guy who made all that stuff possible. Everybody at some level has to have a Mal, the person who gets the circus back up and going every time.
Yeah, and there's a quote in your book about Mal Evans. It's, "I am better than the people trying to reform me." And that hits hard. What do you think Mal meant by that?
Wow, I don't remember that quote.
I swear it's in there.
I
Well,
believe you.
I hope I'm not wrong. Yeah, I am better than the people trying to reform me, man. It just hits so hard, and this mysterious figure. I mean,
Well, there
like you
was
said,
a moment when he gets in between in a philosophical argument between, of all people, Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and it's Paul who thinks of Mal, maybe even takes him for granted, right? And believes that he's there, he works for him, and that's that. And and that he's a follower, not a leader. And it was John Lennon who said, well, maybe those who lead, follow, or actually, maybe you actually are the leader, but you do it differently than others. And it really made Mal feel better. I'm going to reflect on that, though. That's really good.
Yeah.
Um, he did, he struggled a lot inside that band because they were massive egos. They only got bigger because everybody was telling them they were great all of the time. And he had to negotiate that place. And yeah, I don't see that quote. What is the quote again?
I hope I didn't research this incorrectly. I am better than the people trying to reform me. Living the Beatles legend. Is that inaccurate?
Wow, it's not coming up in the book. It sounds like something he would say, though.
Interesting. Well, I'm sorry if I.
That's okay. That's what we edit, right?
Okay, but I got to ask you because you brought up John Lennon, and everyone's got a favorite Beatle, and I'm sorry, that's just mine. I don't know why. But if you could ask John Lennon one question, what would it be?
About John Lennon. Um, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you
Wow,
could interview him
that's
today,
if I could
go
interview him
back in
today,
time. Yeah.
obviously I'd be very happy that, I mean, that's another moment that defines our Gen Xness, right?
Hmm.
That happened obviously during our lifetimes. I'd be very interested. I'm interested in where he was going. One of the last things he said was he said, "This is the direction." They were working on the song "Walking on Thin Ice." He and Yoko on the night he was murdered, and they'd mostly finished it at that point, if not completely finished it. And in fact, they must have because they were going to master it the next morning. And John said, "This is the direction." And I love that. And no one really was able, of course, to interrogate John about that because within an hour or so of saying those words, he was murdered. So I would love to have known more about the direction. What was he hearing in that magnificent song that
Yeah.
was enabling him to imagine this new direction? Because this is John Lennon, right? Who had mapped so many new directions for folks. Failing that, I would love. I think there's a movement right now afoot in Beatles studies that I don't really like, where we're over sentimentalizing Lennon and McCartney, and I can see why people romanticize their heroes and the stories.
Hmm.
Um, my but the problem with that is it real life and romanticization don't mesh very well, right? And
Right.
the
Yeah.
brutal truth is, a guy chose to kill him and wrench him out of the universe, and it denied him every possibility that his life was going to have. And I think one of them that is heartbreaking to me, knowing what an oversized, outsized impact the Beatles left on our culture, is that they never had that moment where they could sit back and say, "What the hell?" Right? I mean,
Right.
that's
Yeah,
robbery.
man.
They deserved
Oh,
to have that
yeah.
moment because they were these guys who went from very quickly being a beat band into realizing that they were artists. And my students ask me a lot, what is genius? I don't really like or believe in genius, but I do think that their genius was saying, wait a minute, we're not just a straight up rock combo. We are capable of things we can't even put into words yet. And they stayed with that idea and quite literally in those 7 years would challenge themselves again and again and again to not keep doing the same thing, which is why the same band that does She Loves You does Come Together, right? As
Right.
bizarre, or A Day in the Life does I Want to Hold Your Hand. I mean, good God.
Yeah.
You mean that's not even in the same universe. The fact that they didn't get to have that moment, I'd want to talk to him about that, about being able to sit back and think about that and feel good about it, if only for a moment, right?
Yeah. How much do you think that, well, I guess it's pretty well documented about how much the psychedelics had an influence on their music and their journey. Do you think if they were still around after John had died, maybe they would have got back together and done another album, like when the wall came down or anything like that? Or do you think they were just done?
I think that intellectually and musically they were done, and it was the right thing. They really had communicated, I think, about everything they possibly could inside the structure of that band. But if John Lennon's not murdered, un, first of all, I would, obviously wish he had not been murdered, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
But having said that, they would have done what every other band did, and they would have gotten together in some way. They might very
Right.
well have cheapened their legacy. I mean, the Beatles' legacy is, it's coated in mystique, and it makes it different, and yes, in some ways better than others. But man, it no, I think the money was getting too big, right? I mean, they were
Yeah.
in
Oh,
the week
yeah.
before Lennon died, it was closing in on $1 billion for them to get back together.
Wow.
I mean, what do you do, right? I mean, if you could make that many people's lives better and give $1 billion to charity in 1981, how do you not do that, right? So,
Yeah.
um, I don't think they could have resisted that much longer. Um, you know, Probably one of the things that was, you have to remember Paul McCartney had become kind of a monolith, right, by the late
Hmm.
1970s himself.
Yeah.
So, there's that hurdle to deal with. But, yeah, I think they would have gotten back together and maybe done any and all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
The money would have been too big, right?
Yep.
And the pressure. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, thinking British invasion and going back to like the start of it all, and I'm going to kind of just let's switch gears to George Martin, kind of innovation and studio magic here. What do you think George Martin saw in the Beatles that others missed?
Well, at first there was nothing he saw at all. He didn't really want to sign them or be involved with them. Um, he
Oh,
was
okay. Yeah.
he's a unique guy in the sense that Well, the Beatles story is beautiful in the sense that you have six guys who push over an entire industry. The four Beatles, who are from Liverpool, which is the backwaters of the nation, right?
Hmm.
Then you've got Brian Epstein, who is has two strikes against him. He is Jewish and he is homosexual, which is literally illegal in the entirety of his lifetime. It was criminalized in England to be gay.
Right.
And then you've got George Martin, who actually, for all of his style and bearing, was from the wrong side of the tracks. He was the most impoverished of everybody. He went away to war and came back, went after going to officers training, and he changed his accent and styled himself as a gentleman. He used to be a Cockney, and now he's a gentleman. And he wasn't the only one. A lot of people came back from the war in that way and reestablished themselves. Some people were fine with it. Others would look at him and say, what are you going at with this funny new voice of yours? We know who you are. Anyway, for George, hooking up with a band from Liverpool did not seem like the continued ticket to success, and he was making a good name for himself in the industry. But they won him over with their humor. He thought they were hilarious. He had a good time with them. And their first few meetings, every time he would meet them, they would save themselves in some way. I mean, the first time, he knew he only had to record like 6 songs with them, so that wasn't that much of a burden. EMI owned the studio outright, so the costs were low. But they made him laugh. They made him laugh so hard he would have tears running down his cheeks. And he worked with some of the great funny men like Peter Sellers and others, and these guys are just killing him. He loved it. Well, they came back again a few months later in September 1962, and he wanted them to record songs written by others. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to be original, and he would challenge them, to go and take his ideas and implement them, and they did. They took "Please Please Me" from this dreary, slow song into a #1 hit. They did what he said, and they won him over. It was what he continued to discover in those 7 years was just that these guys had world-class musical skills. They landed the one drummer who could keep perfect time and be
Ringo. Oh.
no, I mean, you have to have that guy, right? I mean, just like
Yeah.
you have Mal who can do whatever you need him to do. You've got Ringo who can listen and play for 14 hours while they work out a new idea. I mean, a lot of guys can't do that. Their egos won't. Then you've got, George Harrison, who was on fire with guitar fills in those early years, just coming up with ideas. So the reason why he was perfect for them is that George Martin wasn't producing them in the way that you would now. So he wasn't producing them in a high-handed, very controlling way. What he would do is he was very political with them. He would sort of let them define the parameters, because I'm sure in the back of his mind he's thinking they're not going to keep coming in with these world-breaking songs, right? It can't continue.
Right. But it
But
did.
it did. But it did, right? And
Yeah.
he would say, "Well, what have you got for me?" And Lennon and McCartney would vie for his attention. And one time it might be Day Tripper, and then it'll be Paperback Writer, right? Or whatever. And he just would just sit and play it by ear and work with them in that way, thinking there's just no way they can continue to do this. But they do it right on until the last note.
So do you think that talking about that, what you just said there, do you think they kind of maybe pioneered that playing with studio tricks or production tricks or anything? Is there like a studio moment or production trick that like still amazes people today that they might have?
Sure, there were lots of workarounds and problem-solving techniques that they came up with. They had to. They were working in a 4-track environment. I mean, we can fire up GarageBand and do more right now than they ever could. But the reason they had the tricks, the speeding up the piano, for example, the wind up piano technique, or other kinds of problem solving techniques, is because of the vision they had. So once they agreed that they were going to do original material and they weren't going to go over to Tin Pan Alley and find songs for them, suddenly they had to have workarounds in order to take whatever was in their heads for these songs to bring them into being, right? Because they just didn't have the technology yet. So they would have to find these workarounds because what they were hearing in their heads wasn't necessarily possible to reproduce using the technology and equipment of that time. I mean, think about it. I mean, the
Yeah, I can't
effect.
even imagine 4 tracks. I've been in a recording studio, and I think in my day in the 90s when I was trying to record, so it was like 16 tracks. I can't imagine four. That's crazy.
I was giving a talk down in Maryland yesterday, and I was on a stage before a band was coming on. And in front of me, there were probably 40 pedals,
Yeah.
right? I
Hmm.
mean,
Yeah, that's nuts. That's nuts.
the Beatles had one.
Right.
I mean, maybe one, and it,
Yeah.
it made your guitar basically sound like an organ. So you
Yeah.
can't use it that much. Well, how are they going to create new sounds, which they did over and over again? You're going to have to find workarounds to get there. They didn't have that kind of technology that was just sitting there literally at their feet to be able to use. They needed to have the right kind of people working with them to make that happen. So it helps that you have Mal who can run off and find anything in the world that you need. Need an anvil? Mal goes to a theater shop and rents an anvil, right?
Right.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
you've got George Martin who knows about speeding up and slowing down tape. You have this great staff with Ken Townsend and other people at EMI who are capable of rigging things together. They had to build things because they didn't exist yet. I mean, if the Beatles don't end up at EMI, what will eventually become Abbey Road Studios, when Ken Townsend renames it in the 80s, if they're not there, they're not going to sound the same, right? They had these guys working for them who would hear what they needed and would go solder it together. It's just it's the accident of birth and being born in that place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so crazy to think about that. And then just the legend in the music. I've got to ask you though, Dr. Womack, what's the most misquoted or misunderstood idea about the Beatles that just drives you bonkers, absolutely nuts?
Wow, there are a lot of them. I'm getting better at not caring as much because there's just so much lore about them that it's not stoppable. Um, one of the questions I get the most is who's your favorite Beatle? I don't have one. They are the sum of their parts.
Right.
You cannot do what they did without the exact chemistry that they had, right? They needed George Harrison feeling like the junior guy all those years to come out so strong like he does by the end of the band's career. They needed that. They needed the older professional drummer in Ringo Starr, right? Still the oldest Beatle. They needed him to be the guy who was keeping rock solid time. You needed all of those pieces. So I struggle with that. I mean, by the same token, when people say, well, even if they didn't have George Martin, they would have been the same. Yeah, that's garbage.
Right.
It happens exactly how
Yeah.
it happens because they need those pieces and those aspects together. Um, so even now, this as I said, there's this tendency to romanticize. I wish John and Paul had been the greatest of friends too, and had gotten to die old together, right? By the sea.
Hmm.
Um, but murder destroyed all of that, and beyond
Yeah.
that, they had spent many lifetimes together already. I'm okay with the fact that maybe they were never going to have a relationship again, right? So I tend to take the approach of real life, which actually was the name of a song that John Lennon wrote in his latter years. That, part of what the Beatles are about is it's a true story. They're not geniuses. Their genius was staying together. That in fact, I have a slide at the first day of class I show that literally says, "This is a true story." you know,
Right.
because I want to remind them that these are, just like my students' lives, the Beatles' lives, they have friendships that never get repaired. They have one guy's going to be murdered, another George Harrison will die quite young, right? Another Brian Epstein won't even see the end of the story. Uh,
Right.
there it has amazing moments of grandeur and triumph and heartbreaking lows. That's why it is Shakespearean, but it is real life. And I think when we get away from that, we start to misunderstand the miracle of the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
That I think we become less enabled to understand, and not just them, but how any great work of art is created. If you try to elevate it into something like genius, and even the word miracle, I was in my mind thinking, don't say miracle, but then I said miracle, right?
Mhm.
When you do that, you almost cheapen the effort because the effort was enormous, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not phoning it in, doing 100 takes to get the one guitar sound you knew you wanted.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, you don't like the word miracle, but the miracle in that is those four guys found each other. Right.
That's right, and that is the miracle, and that they
Right.
were able to. I don't know about you guys. I was in bands, in garage bands, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
right. I mean, how often is it that you break up for the dumbest reasons? Somebody gets a
Yeah.
girlfriend. You don't. Maybe you don't.
Girls will definitely do it too.
Yeah,
Yes, they
or
do.
somebody has to get a job. They had conscription and going off to war. You
Hmm.
have, if you're in the 60s, Bruce Springsteen, his bands guys were always going off to Vietnam, right?
Right.
You know, it could be, but it could be as simple as I don't like the way you play on the song I wrote.
Yeah.
The way you play Freebird when we do
Yeah.
whatever it is. Whatever
Yeah.
it is, it's
Yeah.
there, and it's very easy for bands to break up. And the fact that they were able to go from 57 with those three core guys and get to 1962 is amazing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not
Yeah.
amazing, but something. And there were moments where they got very lucky, right? And events would manifest themselves to keep them together. You know, and maybe that's what I mean when I appreciate that. That's a good way to think about that.
Yeah.
So I hope this isn't too cliche, and I'm not trying to be controversial or anything here, but just kind of like when I was growing up and discovering the Beatles myself too, being a Gen Xer, it seemed like Yoko Ono kind of took some blame here. Do you think that she had any role in the Beatles breaking up, or do you think they just kind of reached that point?
I don't think she had really any role at all in that. That is kind of maybe one of those parts of the folklore that annoy me. She didn't break them up. I mean, the things that happened that we know caused their demise in the short run while they were together. There would be the fight on May 9th, 1969 at Olympic Studios, where the other three Beatles would bring Alan Klein over to sign with Paul, and Paul drew a line in the sand. He said, maybe there's a better way. And of course, events would prove Paul right, but that didn't help in the moment. And as he said, they broke the Liberty Bell of the Beatles, and they were never able to put it back together again after that night. And that had nothing to do with Yoko, right? They,
Right. Yeah.
um, I mean, you know, another thing that's different about those times, and we Gen Xers can still glimpse this, is that in 1969, Paul even said this. He goes, sometimes I feel like we're a bunch of old codgers sitting around talking about our pensions. You know,
Hmm.
nobody was in a rock band when they were 28. You had to grow up,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
Now, of course,
Yeah.
everybody who can still do it is doing it, including Mr. McCartney and Bruce the other night in their magnificent performance. I mean, if
Definitely.
but we completely think about all of this differently now than we did then. You
Yeah.
know, it was almost embarrassing, right, to still be in a rock band. We're going to be 30 soon and we're going to still do this. The
Right.
pressure, the family pressure to have a family was different. And it's hard to even explain to kids today how steep those pressures were, to settle down, to get married, to have children, right? To do what your parents did and their parents before them. So, and particularly for these guys coming from, that the northern culture. So, I think all of those elements were much, much bigger. That and I don't, I don't know about you guys. I don't want to hang out with the guys I knew when I was 14.
Right.
Man, I never even like thought of it like that.
Every
Yeah,
now and
that's
then I
mind
try.
blowing.
I was down in Houston. I had lunch with a guy I love. I really think he's wonderful. But we had lunch, and he was in one of my bands, and it was hilarious. By the time the lunch was over, I was thinking, these are all the same things that pissed me off in 1982. And
Right.
they're right here, and they're alive and well in 2024.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine being in a band where, you've been getting on each other's last nerve forever. And you're the Beatles, which none of us can imagine, and you're stuck in a hotel room fighting about the same things, right? Um, you-
Over and over. Yeah.
Over and over again. I mean, it's like getting divorced and having to stay with your ex-wife. I mean,
Right.
that's the beauty of the divorce is you get to have the divorce. I mean,
Right. See
um,
ya.
yeah. So I think she had relatively little, other than she was just one of the glaring differences. Hey, who's this woman who's around? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
they could have picked on Linda too, who actually had, as we saw from the Peter Jackson Get Back film, right, a lot of influence.
Hmm.
Yeah. And you talk about pressures and being young and all that stuff. I mean, a guy like me can't even imagine being on that level. And then you look at like George Harrison and you look like Eric Clapton and that whole like just thing. Like I don't even imagine it. But like, and speaking, I can't believe I just said that. But like you look at the video Imagine with John Lennon, and you just see this beautiful, relationship that's blossoming. It was such a simple music video. Like, how do you think that affects artists like that because you got to have some personal life, but yet you're this huge thing.
Well, I mean, and that was part of John's challenge in the early 70s is he had a contract, and maybe the most radical thing he does is when everybody else, when they finally disband the partnership in 1974, everybody else, creates a new contract. Paul resigns. George has Dark Horse Records, but somebody's got to distribute Dark Horse Records, So they sign new deals. John does not sign a new deal until Geffen Records in 1980 for the last album, Double Fantasy. So, you know,
Yeah.
it, yeah, I mean, it's the radical thing he does is he got off the treadmill. He got off the hamster wheel and did that. I mean, that was a pretty crazy thing to do because, he even though being a rock star in your 30s was a weird kind of thing to imagine, he had a contract to fulfill because the Beatles had signed a deal through 1976. So
Yeah. That's
in a way,
incredible.
the radical thing was to quit having a contract, to quit letting what was happening in Billboard magazine, define your life, or not subscribing to Rolling Stone or what have you.
Right. It's like telling people now, don't read the comments.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because it'll drive you nuts.
Right,
So
and it will because, it really does drive you
yeah.
nuts. You should not do it. Because first of all, even the ones who like what you're doing and get what you're doing aren't entirely getting what you're doing. And then you've got the ones that are just off base. And then you have what's funny about Amazon, right? When you look at those comments, is that
Hmm.
you've got people who are complaining about the packaging, which you
Right.
have nothing to do with. So
Right.
it's quite insane.
Yeah. All
Never
right. I
read
got one.
press releases, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right. So a lot of fans ask what can we learn from the Beatles? But if John, Paul, George, and Ringo were alive today and in their 20s, what do you think they'd learn from us?
Well, I hope what we learn from them is what I tell my students is, I'm not saying you're going to be the Beatles, but why not go for greatness? Whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that is your area of talent, go after that and go hard, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
if you discover that there's a kind of storytelling you're good at, share it with the world. Find a way to make that your life's work. Don't tarry. Don't waste time. You can spend a lot of time diverting yourself further and further away from a contribution you might make. And that God knows, right? There are plenty of people in the world, family members, parents, significant others who will try to talk you out of it.
Right.
So, um, I
It's
think the best part of their story is the perseverance and again, getting better at something. I mean, the work that they can do playing guitar and they're very good in 1962 doesn't even compare to 1969.
right.
The facility they have with their instruments, whatever
Yeah.
your instrument is, learn how to play it that way. So I would hope that, and I can't wait until the next Beatles. I want the next Beatles to come around because I would love to experience a pop explosion where whomever it is goes from 0 to 60 like they did.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible, but I would love to hear it and see it.
Yeah, it's funny you
Absolutely.
mentioned that because I've been having this argument with my son who's 17 about AI, right? And the tools for creating like videos. And he argues that, people are just going to produce garbage. But like some of the new latest releases, like the amount of believability that you can create from AI gives people like me or like Ian or everyday Joes the ability to tell a story, right? That they can tell themselves and not have to go to some huge Hollywood budget, or producer or studio to produce that story. So I'm kind of encouraged by what we'll see in the future, having these powerful tools at our
I like that
fingertips.
you guys are having that debate because I think, on the one hand, I agree with him. The
Right.
dregs of AI are very easy to see, right?
Yes. But it's
Um,
getting slimmer
but
and slimmer every day.
if it democratizes an industry that previously you had to have tens of millions of dollars to even participate in, then that's probably a good thing if you can find a way. The difference will always be the quality, right? So
Correct.
we know that there are AI sites now where you can go and it will do a pop song for you, right?
Yeah.
Um, I've not heard one of them yet that was not goofy, even
Yeah.
for all of its best effort, right? Um, the difference maker is going to be what you do with these tools. So
Yep.
if you can take, as you just described it very well, if you can take those tools and make a film of your own and really tell a top-notch story that makes us feel something deeply, right?
Hmm.
Then Godspeed, right? Then
Right. Yep.
the tools are worth it. I think for me, I use a lot of AI in making my classroom presentations. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm not using it for my ideas, but I'm using it to help bring them into vision.
Yeah, exactly.
And then in that way, it's wonderful.
Yep. You're on mute, Ian.
Okay, we know you've been asked everything, but is there a Beatles question you wish someone would ask you?
Not really. I like to talk about. I do get asked a lot about what the best Beatles song is. I think "A Day in the Life" is the most important Beatles song. Um, it's hard to even, I think, even create a counter argument. But it's not my favorite, right? I mean, that changes all the time. That's what's great about them is they have so much. They're an embarrassment of riches that I can hear a note or a sound in a particular song that I want to go back to and explore. But that's true of all music. I think music especially is made up of moments and movies too, right? They're made up of moments that we live for, that we're waiting for, a particular performance or I can hear the sound of a guitar sustain in certain parts of, say, let's pick a random Beatles song, "Happiness is a Warm Gun," that when I turn it on, I'm waiting to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
There's some violin notes that I adore in the song "Martha, My Dear" on the White Album. I listen for those notes. I'm in there for that. I'm thinking about writing a book about moments and trying to understand this more because I do think life is defined by moments, and what we look for are often instances, that have us coming back to music and film and television and what have you.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
would
and
be cool.
yeah, and music is a big one because like there's an emotional connection with it too. So, like when you hear somebody sing, like, I've watched America's Got Talents, right? Like some of them are pretty hokey, but there's some of those singers or some of those artists that are on there that like you get the goosebumps, right? And they're like, oh,
That's
that
right. Every
person's
now and
going
then
far.
something emerges that
Yep.
eclipses the experience, and
Yeah.
that's when suddenly things matter.
Yeah.
And it's drama, right? I mean, it's one thing that the Beatles are very good at is creating drama and energy. And Steve Van Zandt was on my podcast talking about. I asked him, "Well,
Wow.
how does a band work, right? What makes a band work?" He said, "It's only energy. Either you can create it or you can't. And when you're
Yeah.
young, if you can create energy, they'll let you keep playing the dance club because you get people out on the floor and they'll buy more beer
Right.
and they'll keep having you. Eventually, it is, can you transmit that energy into your original songs, right? And I mean, let's pick on Born to Run. The amount of energy and drama in that one tune and the places that Bruce goes, it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. I mean, it's a staggering. You could do a semester on that song.
Oh
Um,
man. Yeah.
Maybe not a semester, but definitely a unit.
Yeah.
It's just marvelous, right? Um, the journey that song takes is extraordinary. Journey, "Don't Stop Believing," a beloved song.
Yep.
What do I listen to? I listen every time. I listen for that guitar bit up front, where
Yep.
you know where I'm talking about, where the echo kicks in,
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
shoots off into the stratosphere.
Yep.
I love the song, but it never gets better than that moment.
Right. It's the opening
Right.
energy moment. Yeah.
All right, we've gotten to the portion of the episode that we like to call Jared's Five. As we start to wrap it up here. So Jared's going to ask you some questions.
All right.
Uh,
So first one is if you could be any one of the Beatles, who would you be? If you had to pick one.
oh, I'd be Ringo. I really would.
Yes.
I mean, you're sitting back there and you get to watch all of this happen,
Mm-hmm.
and pick your spots. He he's still with us, a deep feeling person, and he's a survivor. My God, he survived every childhood malady that you could. I mean, he didn't learn to read
Mm-hmm.
until I think he was like 9. I mean, and it was thanks to a neighbor girl who taught him how. I mean, I love his story, and I love, um, I like his ego. I love watching him and his all-star band. He'll play with guys from Toto or whatever, and he doesn't care. He'll play
Right.
on Africa,
With anybody.
right? It
Yep.
doesn't matter to him or hold the line
Yeah.
or whatever. That's what's wonderful about Ringo is he knows how to sublimate his ego, and yet he's very, very good at what he does. Um, uh, I would probably go in that direction.
Okay. Good.
But
Favorite.
in truth, I don't think I could have the guts to live any of their lives. My God,
Yeah.
mine's
Yeah.
difficult enough.
Right. All right. Another a fun one. What's your favorite movie of all time?
That changes a lot.
Yeah.
It,
Or one you find yourself going back to time and time again?
I go back a lot to Casablanca.
Mm,
Um, it's a masterpiece of writing. Um, is it my favorite? I mean, I like Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia. I can't
mm,
watch it too often though because it's such an ordeal.
right.
Um, in more recent years, I think a lot about oh gosh, The Prestige, the movie about the
Oh, yeah. That was good.
magician. Yeah,
Loved that movie. Yeah.
I do too, and I come back to it a lot because it's about creating illusion, which
Yeah.
all of this is, right? You have to
Right.
create an illusion to lull us into sitting in a theater for 2 hours to watch somebody's movie or to queue it up on Netflix or whatever, or to create an illusion with a song. So those are a few of them, but it changes all
Okay.
the time.
All right. Yeah, that's good. All right. Favorite Saturday morning cartoon?
Oh, it's always Scooby Doo for me.
Scooby Doo. Uh-huh.
Um, I liked the tropes. I liked the guest stars.
Yeah.
The whole thing worked for me. Um, yeah, that was definitely. I mean, I had several. I'm sure you guys
Right.
did
That
too.
was the one. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I came back to that one because there was something that had to be solved every episode.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what appealed to me.
Okay. Cool. All right. What's one thing that people should know about you that maybe they don't?
I mean, the most important thing to me is just to provide people with access. I think it comes from a lifetime of working in higher education. I'm only interested really in giving everybody equal access to everything so that, if you want to make a film, how can I help you do it? Right. If you want to write your own book, how do I help you do that?
Yeah.
That's the most important thing to me, you know.
Awesome.
And
That's cool, man.
well, I appreciate that, but it's when I think we all started out being roughly of the same age, access was not easy to get,
No.
right? I went to a massive state school with 50,000 students, and they were banking on 50% of us not making it.
Right.
You know, I'm proud to say that that's not our attitude anymore at most places.
Right.
You feel a debt to everybody. Everybody needs you. We need everybody to make it, right? You don't want a bunch of people out there with student loans who can't pay them off and don't have a degree. Uh,
Right.
and we were inviting that back in our day. So I think it's beholden on us to just help people. I know you guys would do this too. Somebody wants to start a podcast, you'd help them learn how, right?
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
That's what the job is, of
Yep.
living and creating opportunity for people. So that to me, that's the thing, the only thing that matters.
All right. That's a good one. All right. If you could go back in time and tell your teenage self one thing, what would it be?
Oh, I know that. Don't stop playing the French horn. I didn't get it at the time, but
Hmm.
I'd spent.
Nice.
I talk about this a lot with students. About when they come to school, what do they have to give up? Don't give up a damn thing.
Right.
Get rid of the high school boyfriend or girlfriend because they're not. You can't. they're not going to grow with you, right? Most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I made a huge mistake. I intentionally, I'd been first horn in the orchestra. I worked for years to do that. And of course, at 18, I resented that instrument. It's hard to play.
Yeah.
It took up a lot of my time. I thought I was cooler than the French horn because I could also play the guitar, right,
Right.
etc.
Which
But
is way cooler sometimes.
yeah, I mean, you don't see
I
that many,
get it. Yeah.
Or girls would like the
you
guitar
don't
more,
see
right?
many people amplifying French horns yet. But I was damn wrong because my life was structured by that instrument, right?
Yeah.
And what I gave up, it probably took me 2 or 3 years, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years to find myself and recreate my routine and my structure. And it was really daunting the more I think about it. I had built a structure. Maybe I didn't like it completely, but it what I didn't know was how to replace it with something else
Yeah.
or how to rebuild it in a new way with a new device. Because I was a young guy, right? I was 18 or
Mhm.
18 or whatever. Um, so that's what I talk to myself about.
Yeah.
Is you think that that's the thing you want to do.
Hmm.
Um,
No desire to master the theremin, then, is what you're telling me.
but
There's got to be an art to that.
but you know what? I would never be, if you put one in front of me, I'd know how to play it.
Right.
And it was because of the French horn, I could play a lot of instruments.
Hmm.
I wasn't remembering was having that back there, it didn't mean I had to be in a professional orchestra, right? After
Right.
graduation. But it was a device that kept me plugged into art and thinking about music and what I could do with it. And when you're young, you just don't put those two things together very well.
Yeah. All right. Last one. What's a question you want our next guest to answer? Can be anything.
We're in a great moment of episodic television, where documentaries about true
Right.
crime or classic novels or longer storytelling is taking place over a season of 10 episodes or two or three. I think a great question would be which one really moves them and why. We're in this great moment. I think it bears examination. Why is it that I might not sit down and watch an episode of Dateline for 1 or 2 hours, but last night I watched a true crime documentary that was 7 episodes.
Right.
And I know at some level it was the longer, expanded kind of approach, right? That kind of deep
Yeah.
dive. But that's a good question.
All right. Yeah, that
Because
is.
of course,
Okay.
when the three of us grew up, one of my favorite shows is Rockford Files.
Oh, yeah.
And while there were some pieces that were episodic and recurring, a lot of things would just remake themselves every episode, right? Jim would fall in love with a new woman.
Yeah.
He'd be kissing
Yeah.
on, yeah. I mean, and we were okay with that. But of course, the entire genre has gone places that are different since then.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my favorite was MacGyver.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm kind of that jack of all trades now, too, though, so that's probably why.
Well, that'll be good, especially if you're ever in some perilous situation. You can get
Right.
yourself out of it.
Yeah.
Like what if you're stuck inside a trash compactor deep in space somewhere?
Right.
You got to solve that problem.
Yeah. Hopefully I have R2D2 around to save me.
That's right.
Dr. Kenneth Womack, you've been absolutely wonderful. We've loved having you on here. You're author of over 30 books. We know you got a jet to do some more writing. Is there any new project you're working on right now?
I am. Maybe we'll catch up in a year and see if I do it. I'm working on the history of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang right now, and I'm loving it.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
awesome.
yeah, I've always been curious
Nice.
about this car and how it came into being. And it's a
Yeah,
crazy story, and I'm having some fun with it. So hopefully I won't lose sight of this.
that's
Well,
cool. I look forward to it.
Yeah, that is cool, man. And so you're on the Everything Fab Four podcast. I've checked out. You guys have had some incredible guests. I saw Billy Idol on there, Darius Rucker. Uh, where else can people find your work?
well, I do the podcast for salon.com, and then I write a couple books, hopefully every year. I like to, they can go to everythingfab4.com or kennethwomack.com. It's the same place, and check out what's going on.
Awesome.
That's so awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, everybody. This has been Common X with Jared and Ian, and today's guest, Dr. Kenneth Womack. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you, fellow Gen Xers.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today to the podcast, Common X with Jared and Ian. We really appreciate you guys and would love your support. So make sure you click that subscribe or like button or follow us on all our social media platforms and on YouTube and Spotify, because that would really help us out. And that helps us bring more episodes to you guys every week, and hopefully from content that you guys want to see. So reach out, TikTok, YouTube, leave comments. If there's anything that you guys want to see or any guests that you want us to try and get on, let us know. We do have a good lineup coming. So thank you again. We love you guys. Thanks for your support. And we'll see you next time. And remember, common sense isn't that common. So that's why we're bringing common sense back from Generation X.